This movie tutorial is all about capture sharpening, and in particular how to use the detail panel controls that are found in the Camera Raw dialog. Basically, all images need to be sharpened at some extent when they're first brought into Photoshop. In the case of scanned images, or those that have been captured in JPEG mode, these usually don't need sharpening because the sharpening has been carried out in the camera or in the scanner software. So for example, when you look at the scanner software, although it may give the impression sometimes of saying that no sharpening has been applied, you do need to check all the preferences to see whether that's really the case. And you have the option basically to use the scanner software to do the pre-sharpening if that's what you're happy with, or you can use some of the instructions provided in the book to carry out the sharpening in Photoshop and Camera Raw. The overall goal in all this is to take into account the fact that different types of images have different sharpening requirements, and this will be dependent on which areas of the image you consider to be important and need to be sharpened, and also quite importantly which areas of the photograph do you want to keep preserved and not have sharpened. And we can do all this using the new controls that we have in Camera Raw. Camera JPEGs, as I say, don't need sharpening because for better or worse this is usually carried out by the camera itself. So in the case of camera JPEGs, these should be just opened up into Photoshop and edited straight away and should never need any further sharpening. In the case of scanned TIFFs or JPEGs, as I mentioned, with the software that you're using, you may or you may not need to sharpen these photographs, and if sharpening has been disabled, as I explained in the book, you can use the Camera Raw controls to carry out the sharpening, or you can refer to the PDF chapter on scanning on sharpening scanned images, which gives you the Photoshop instructions for carrying out sharpening directly. And in a case of raw camera files, with all raw files, these always need to have some sharpening because in this case you're working with the data, the original data straight off of the sensor, and no sharpening will have been applied at all. So it's important then to use Camera Raw to carry out the sharpening there. So to show you how this is done, at the moment you can see that I've got the CS4 DVD opened up here, and I'm looking at Chapter 4, the Chapter 4 folder inside the Images folder. And here is the photograph that you would have seen being used in Chapter 4 of the book to demonstrate how the sharpening sliders work. And what we're going to do here is open this up into Camera Raw. Now, although this is a TIFF image, as I mentioned in the book, this has not received any sharpening at all, so it's unsharpened data, but you do need to open it up into Camera Raw, and we can do this on a Mac by using Command R or Control R on the PC, and this will open up the TIFF into Camera Raw where we can start working on the detail panel controls. Now, it's quite important to make sure that you look at the image and view it at 100% so that you can see the results on screen at the 100% viewing. And let's go through them one by one. The first two are the amount and the radius, which I work on together, and for these, to explain how they work, in the case of the amount slider, quite clearly as you drag the slider to the right and you increase the amount, you can see that you can see the artifacts that are created in the image, and you can see the increased sharpening. It's gone very crunchy, and obviously 150 is way too much, and normally we keep the sharpening down quite low. If you hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC, you can see how the sharpening is applied to the luminosity in the image, and this is how all Camera Raw sharpening is applied. It's only carried out on the luminance information of the image rather than on the color information, and this is fairly similar to the techniques such as fade luminosity in Photoshop when you apply the unsharp mask filter, or the method that some people prefer of converting to lab mode and then sharpening the lightness channel. Although I think it's important to point out here, and I say this in the book, that arguments about the differences between the two methods that I just described, it's much more important, I think, that when you come down to looking at what can be done with the detail and the masking controls to actually modify, suppress and target the sharpening afterwards, and these have a much greater impact on the successful quality of the pre-sharpening that you can achieve using Camera Raw. So working with the amount and with the radius, if I hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on the PC, you can see an overlay view of the sharpening, and this gives you a pretty good indication of how the radius is working. So for example, if I take the radius down to a low amount and I'll increase the sharpening up here so we can see it more clearly, if we work with the radius at a low amount, you'll notice that all the detail on the left and on the bars going through the picture, you can see how the edges are very much emphasized in those fine edge areas. And then as I drag the slider over to the right, you'll notice that when we go to the maximum setting over here, you'll notice how more emphasis is placed on the softer edges of the picture. So for example, the lips, the nose and the eyes are given more emphasis as I increase the radius amount. So as a general rule, when you're working on images with fine detailed areas such as buildings, landscapes and fine details in any picture, use a lower radius amount. And then when you're working with softer tone subjects, like for example the portrait shown here on the right, then these are a case for using a wider radius, although usually I would stick to within the limits of about 0.6 and about 1.3, and typically you can leave it set at around about 1. The next two sliders down here, the detail and the masking, I regard as suppression controls. If we take the detail slider all the way up to 100, the effect that you get working with the radius and with the amount slider is similar to working with the unsharp mask filter in Photoshop. The detail slider is a suppression, so that the lower that you take the setting, the more that it suppresses the edge artifacts that are created using the amount and the radius sliders. And the effect this has is that when you're working with, say for example, images with high detail, for example like the detail shown over here on the left, for these types of subjects you'll find that it's probably advisable to keep the detail setting quite high. And then when you're working with portraits where you don't want to overemphasize areas like the skin texture here, then you'll take the detail down to a lower setting, and this suppresses some of the sharpening halos to create a much smoother effect. And if you hold down the Option key on the Mac and the Alt key on a PC, and remember for all these you must be at 100% viewing for these two grayscale previews to work, you can see the effect of the detail slider, so that as I take the slider all the way to the left, you can see how it suppresses the halos and you get much smoother, clearer skin tones there. And then as I take it all the way to the right, you can see how it, the adverse effect it will have on the skin tones. Yet on the other hand, if you look at the area of the left of the picture, if you look at the detail in the stripes and in the building, you can see how it's actually producing a more desirable, more emphasized effect. And in a case like that, you would probably turn down the amount sharpening. And then we come to the masking control. And what the masking control does is that it filters out the sharpening. And the best way for me to show you this is to hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt key on a PC, and drag with the masking slider. And this is building a mask on the fly, where the black areas that you see appearing here will hide the image from being sharpened. So it will prevent the sharpening from affecting areas which are black. And the areas that are white will allow the sharpening to go through. So you can see that if I take the mask all the way up to the maximum setting here for the portrait area of the image, can you see how it's really hiding all of the skin tone areas, and it will prevent those areas from being sharpened, but will leave the areas around the eyes and the important detail around the lips, it will leave those areas white, and so the sharpening will then be focused and targeted onto those particular areas. And in general, you'll find that with subjects like fine detailed landscapes, etc., architectural subjects, you want to keep the masking fairly low, so that you get the most efficient sharpening applied to those areas. But where you've got subject matter such as skin tones, then take the masking higher. Well, that's an introduction to the basic controls. Let me cancel out of that and then just run through a few different examples of how we would work with them. These images, as I say, are all on the DVD. So let's open up this landscape image and take the viewing percentage to 100%. Then go to the Details panel control. And for this particular image, I'm going to take the amount up to around about 50. And for the radius, because I want to emphasize the important edge details in this picture, this is an area, this is a picture which needs to have a lower radius setting, so I'm going to take the radius down to 0.8 here, and then for the detail I want to see more detail coming through, so I'm going to take the detail slider up high so that I don't suppress the halos quite so much. And I don't need to use the masking slider at all, because in this case I want to make sure that I see as much sharpening coming through as possible, and I don't really need to mask anything out. And you can click on the preview toggle box at the top there, or you can press the P key to see a preview of the image before and then compare it with an after. So at any time when you're working with the detail panel controls, you can toggle between the two states to see the effect of the sharpening. Let me cancel out of that. Let's go to a subject which is fairly similar but has got finer edge detail, and again I'm going to take the viewing percentage up to 100%, and let's just find an area to work with. Let's look at this particular section of the picture. We'll go to the detail panel controls, and for the sharpening amount here I'm going to play around with the slider here. I don't want to go up too high, so I'm going to take this back to around about 40 for here, and then for the radius let's just hold down the Option key on a Mac and the Alt key on a PC, and you can see that as I take the radius down lower, the lower I go I can really emphasize a lot of the fine edges that need to be affected. If I was to take it up too high, then it's not really going to work quite so well, but if I take it down low I can really target the halos around those fine areas of detail that need to be sharpened in this photograph. As for the detail slider, again I don't want to suppress the details too much, so I'm going to take that up quite high, and once again I don't need to do anything with the masking, so that would be the ideal capture sharpening to apply for this particular image. Let me cancel out of that, and then lastly come to the portrait, and this one does actually require quite a different approach. Let's again take this to 100% so that we can view this in close-up. Go to the detail panel. For the sharpening controls here, I'm not going to sharpen quite so much. I'm going to only take it up to about 35 in this case. And then for the radius, if I hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt key on a PC, you can see that if I was to take the radius down too low, as I did for the other two pictures, then it doesn't really have much effect on the areas that need to be sharpened most. But whereas if I take it up higher and settle for an amount of about sort of 1.2 on the radius, I can get the right amount of sharpening that I want to take place around the eyes, the lips, and on the stubble down here, but not so much on the skin tones. With the detail, if I was to increase the detail like I did for the other pictures, you can see how this would have a horrible crunchy effect on the skin tones. So I'm going to take it down quite low, so I really suppress the detail in that photograph. And with the masking for this type of picture, this really does need to have a lot of masking applied. And as I showed you in that demo image at the beginning, if I take this up high, you can see that by increasing the masking amount, all the black areas will be areas which will hide the sharpening effect, and there won't be any sharpening taking place on those parts of the picture, but the white areas will let the sharpening go through. And I would consider that to be the best sharpening combination to use for that particular photograph. So let me go and cancel out of that, and just remind you once again that these pictures are available on the DVD. Open them up using Command R, Control R, that's Command R on the Mac, Control R on the PC, and view them at 100% to make the same judgments as I did then. Now let me just go and summarize the different types of sharpening that we've shown you here. So to summarize this sharpening, as I said at the beginning, the ideal situation is to look at images that you want to that you bring into Camera Raw, that you want to eventually open up into Photoshop, and you analyze your photographs, and there is an ideal sharpened state that you want to bring all these photographs to. And as you've seen already, each of these three images that I worked on all required a different amount of pre-sharpening to get them to what I consider to be the ideal sharpened state. So for example, in the case of the first image that we showed, that particular image needed a 45 amount sharpen combined with a 0.8 radius to bring it into that ideal sharpened state, followed by a 60 detail, so that we didn't suppress the detail quite so much. We didn't suppress the halos as much as we'd done in some of the other photographs, without any masking applied, and that achieved the best pre-sharpening for that particular photograph. Meanwhile, we had this other image over here which required a similarish amount. In this case, it needed an amount of 40, but with a smaller radius, because as I showed you just now, I needed to target those fine areas of the picture, and I did that by using a small radius. This was followed by a higher amount on the detail because I wanted to achieve minimal amount of suppression on the detail, and no masking was applied because it wasn't needed in that particular image. And that was the pre-sharpening I applied to achieve that photograph there. And then finally we came on to the portrait example, and for this photograph we needed to add a smaller amount of only 35, but a much greater radius, because as I explained, the larger radius was more appropriate for bringing out the softer edge detail on the eyes, the lips, and on the rest of the facial features. And that brought the image into the ideal state there, which was followed with a lower amount of detail because I wanted to suppress more of the halo artifacts in the picture, combined with a 70 masking because I wanted to use the black areas of the mask to hide those areas from being sharpened, whereas the white areas allowed the sharpening to filter through, and that achieved the finished result that we saw there. And so each of these images have now been optimized to their best condition, and that really summarizes the philosophy behind capture sharpening. From there onwards, as you'll find if you watch the other movie on this DVD, which is about print sharpening then becomes a single formula process, which is dependent on the type of print process that you're going to and the resolution of the image, as well as the paper finish. So in the case of capture sharpening, you sharpen for the content, and then for the print sharpening, it should then be a single sharpening process dictated by the type of print output that you're going to.